Welcome to the Sharon Fitzmaurice podcast, where we celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. Please check out my membership online, Soulful Journeys, my upcoming Reiki training, and my upcoming retreats through SharonFitzmauriceMindfulness.com. And now, on to our next guest. Sile Walsh specializes in leadership, development, coaching, and psychology. She is an award-winning international best-selling author of Inclusive Leadership, Navigating Organizational Complexity. It's a transformative guide that reshapes the whole narrative around professional development, organizational behavior, leadership, diversity, and inclusion. Through a blend of personal narratives, research, industry insights, and reflective exercises, Sheila redefines inclusion as a need for every human being to thrive and perform in organizations. Sheila, you're very welcome.
Thank you for having me, Sharon. I really appreciate it.
I love that. And I love the idea of, redefining inclusion as well as a need for every human being to thrive, something that is so important and we need to have more conversations about. But can you share a little bit about your own journey, Sheila, and what led you to work, to leadership development and psychology?
Hmm. It's interesting because it was never intentional. Do you know the way when you look back, you can see the dots and you think, oh, that makes sense. But actually, I guess where this all started was long before I even knew what was happening. But you might know by the accent, I spent time in England, even though I'm an Irish family. Being Irish in England up until I was about 4 or 5 meant that in England I wasn't English enough. I was too Irish. But in Ireland, when you come back to East Cork with an English accent, and I'm the only one out of my siblings with this accent, you're not Irish enough then. And so it was the first time that I realized that I was less Irish than I thought I was originally. But also it was the first time I realized that people make judgments about you that you have little control over. And then when I was in my teens and secondary school, I found out I was dyslexic. Now, most people are upset about that finding. My parents thought they were going to have to break it to me. And I was deeply relieved because I knew something was wrong. And I don't mean with me. I knew something was wrong. I was in school and I was quite smart and bright and curious, but I was barely surviving basic tests. Um, and when I discovered I was dyslexic and I understood what that meant, I realized that I wasn't, off the wall. I was accurate. There was something happening. And that was the first time I realized that the environment you're in has a direct impact on whether you thrive or not. And I was about 15 when I left school. So I was an early school leaver, despite all of the advice and to my parents' panic, I think. And the reason I left was at the same time I was working in an absolutely fantastic hotel in Ireland under an amazing chef. And when I walked into that kitchen, and I was walking to that kitchen from about 11, I convinced them to take me in. Um, I asked, like, for 3 Saturdays running, I went up and knocked on the door, asked for the head chef. He said, we don't have a job. And on the fourth Saturday, I was like, they don't have a job. But that he didn't say no. So I went up and I said, I'm volunteering. Where can I start? And he was like, oh, just put an apron on. Because it was probably costing him too much dealing with me each Saturday that it was like, just send her into the kitchen. So I started at about 11 just volunteering, and it only went on for a few weeks, and then he was like, "Oh, she's actually serious." So we had to find a way because I was a kid, but I just wanted to be in the kitchen. And when I was in the kitchen, I knew that there was a different experience than what I was having in school. I was learning quickly, I was enjoying it. I was being given out to, but I was figuring things out quickly. I was copying onto things quickly. And then at about 16, I ended up in charge of a section in the kitchen because I'd left school. And everyone there was older than me, like everyone. But also in my section, I was leading a number of people. And I say leading loosely because apologies for anyone who I was leading at the time. What I had learned about management wasn't good. Right. I learned that you shout at people till they figure it out. I learned that there's no joke you can't tell. You know, I didn't learn much about being encouraging or motivational. I just learned how to deliver results. But at the time, that was an environment I thrived in. And then I remember noticing that that environment, there was a lot of really smart people ending up in that environment, often because they didn't have other choices, because maybe school wasn't for them, or maybe they had an artistic flair. And then I did some trips back and forth to India, and I realized that I didn't really want to cook. I was more interested in well-being and why some people thrive in certain environments while others thrive in others. Um, and that kind of got me curious. I volunteered. I was a personal assistant to a number of CEOs. And I just found myself repeatedly in spaces with senior leaders or supporting senior leaders. And then I was also learning and doing courses on the side. And I joke, I left secondary school at 15 with only a junior cert. But from that day on, I actually haven't left education. I've been in a course since that day. So if I'd only known what I was doing at the time, I might have thought twice about it. But what I figured out was that if you learn while you work, for me, and maybe for people like me, then what ends up happening is you can actually figure out what you're good at. Whereas a lot of the time in school, they only use the measure of what you're taught, and then you have to make some big life decisions based on what you're taught. But you're not taught a fraction of what's required in the world. So, and no criticism, like schools are doing their best. I was lucky enough to have some really exceptional teachers. I was also unlucky enough, like most people, to have some awful teachers. But the exceptional ones kind of get you through a little bit. And then because I had mentors in the workplace, I worked out that my well-being and other people's well-being wasn't as simple as being well or not, or going to work or not going to work. It was whether the environment let them do good work that they could feel good about, that they felt that they were thriving in and growing in, but equally that they were going somewhere and adding value. And just over the years, this has kind of all accumulated into me landing myself kind of in this area. Um, and just pursuing my curiosity. So I left school because I was curious about working in the kitchen. But to be honest, having worked in other kitchens, I was more curious about working under that chef, my chef de partie, those people in that environment, because we worked in an environment where you'd go out and pick the herbs, where you'd get the rhubarb from the grass. Like we were involved in the kind of holistic view of food, not just ordering it in packets. And there was something about that holistic view that I think shaped me very early on. And then the other part of that I think has shaped me was in that place, there was a lot of very wealthy people living, working, partially living, but also visiting. And there was equally poorer people and people from all different classes. And for me, I realized that people from different classes, and this at a very young age, and different financial situations had different pressures and stresses and concerns. And I realized it wasn't just the environment you were in working, but also some of the rules you learnt from your family, your safety, your resources, your communities. And so I always knew these things were niggling, but it took a long time for me to now be able to go, oh, this all kind of comes together and makes sense. So I just pursued training that I was curious in, which has then led me to here, I guess.
Wow, that's amazing, Sheila. I love the fact that your curiosity at 11 years of age, but also a determination, even at a young age, to say, I'm not going to give up, I want to find out more of this, I want to learn more. And also, and I think it's something that we need to speak about a lot more as well, is that school, the way the school system is at present, that it isn't for everybody. And I'm seeing a lot more offering apprenticeships, and we're seeing more awareness around that, different genders, different apprenticeships, where once it was just male orientated or female orientated, that now that we can step into that which we are curious, and that one size does not fit all, and that path of school is not for everybody, and it should be celebrated more. And I think that's why having people like you on the podcast to share those amazing stories is really going to inspire a lot of parents to look at their children that are coming up to exams and going, I need to say to my child, it's okay if you're not the same as Mary down the road, that there are other options, and that we as the adults need to feed that information to our children and the upcoming generation, that there
Mm.
is a place for them in the world and they are included. But does that start also with workplaces and organizations, Sheila?
Yeah, so I think workplaces, for two reasons. One, from a moral point of view, I think workplaces that think about their moral impact tend to attract and retain certain types of people, which I would argue are probably easier to work with in lots of ways and make maybe integrity-based decisions at moments of challenge. But there's this other side, which is workplaces that create spaces for people with different skills and approaches will outperform. And the research is so strong on this when they have environments where the way they work is accommodated, and I say this to a reasonable amount because I do know that there's this kind of unrealistic expectation sometimes of how much accommodation, and then there's also sometimes an under expectation. But when you accommodate people to the point where they can perform, you're going to outperform your competitors because you're going to have people with a broader set of skills, worldviews, approaches, way of doing things. And so workplaces can both benefit and also be positive in society. By thinking about their role. So some of the things when I work, and there are great organizations out there who are going to schools and colleges to demonstrate different identities and genders in different roles. But also there's things like changing your job descriptions, checking if you've got kind of biases towards certain types of people. So for instance, I was speaking to an engineer recently, and she said on her first job there was only men's toilets.
Mm,
So like if you're an interviewer on a job and there's only men's toilets, you've got a piece of information straight away about that workplace. So there's some kind of like hopefully nobody else has that right now, but there's some kind of subtle things you can think about. Can somebody in a wheelchair come and add value to this workplace? Can somebody with different flexible hour needs come and add value? And if workplaces think about that, it might be extra work up front, but we know again the research is saying you will attract more talent, retain more talent, and you're likely to be more competitive. So what I love about where all this intersection comes together for me, I'm not just saying be good to people, and I'm not just saying people go and work. I'm saying that workplaces and people together can create really positive outcomes for each other. It's not, one for the other. Actually, if you want your workplace to be a positive place for you, you have to think about how you add value, but you've also to think about what you need, and your workplace needs to do the same as well.
mm. So, how do you help organizations truly harness their employees' potential in a way that kind of feels human or sustainable?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is when I work with leaders, I try to talk to them about diversity beyond this label of diversity based on legislation, right? Diversity just means difference. And there's not a person you work with that doesn't have differences to each other. And if we think about when you're working with people, and instead of trying to label them with identities or that person's different to that person, the central question I try to work with is what do they need to thrive and perform?
Mm,
And when I help leaders to think differently about this, so by understanding how to think about that, how to ask the questions, how to engage with people, they tend to make better policy decisions, process decisions, but also they tend to do better with the clients, with the customer, because the way of thinking about people as solid, fully functioning people with valid sets of needs allows us to think about how we help them to do better and do more. Um, so for me, it's much more about understanding that some of our initial approaches to these things might be off. We might be trying to look for a label, or we might be trying to, go, oh, these people need this, instead of just going, Sharon, what would help you today?
mm,
What do I need to know about working with you?
mm,
Instead of assuming, oh, I can do this if you need it. Like it's to learn to harness those relationships much more effectively and then to be strategic about how you apply them. So that's where maybe training comes in, that's where some consultancy comes in or facilitation. But really, it's about understanding the space where the organizational needs and the people's needs meet and support each other. And that's kind of the main place where any intervention I do kind of works in that, the kind of utilizing the power of the people you have working with you.
mm. And as you're talking about that, it all comes down to leadership, really, doesn't it? And who is leading the team. And I know going back, leadership and management, was seen as disciplinary almost, and non-approachable and non-personable. And now we know that good leaders, are showing that vulnerable and personal side of themselves because without their team, there is, this is where it all comes down to. They need their team to feel like they are appreciated. But again, many leaders struggle with vulnerability. So, how do you support leaders in embracing being authentic without feeling, I suppose, exposed, that they still
Mhm.
feel like they're on top of things and, that they are able to lead in that structured way, but that their employees know they can come to them like that and saying, this is what I need to be able to perform better in my daily tasks.
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. So the first thing I want to define leadership, because most people without the title leader don't think they're a leader. There's three types of leadership. There is the thought leader, That's someone who comes to you for advice, whether it's because you're an accountant or you're just smart or they just value your opinion. There's lots of thought leaders who aren't in positional leadership, but they have a big influence on the decisions people make because people trust them. Then there's social leaders, which are the people who build up trusting relationships. And so people come to you because they trust the relationship with you. Often thought leaders and social leaders themselves don't think that they're leaders. They just think about the positional leader. So the first thing to say is, and then there's positional leader. Everyone in every position of the organization has the ability to lead from where they are appropriately. They can be self-directive, they can be supportive, they can be influential. That's all leadership is. A leadership title has some obligations to the organization, but everyone can lead. So that's the first thing. In terms of vulnerability and authenticity, I have a caveat around that because a lot of people teach to be vulnerable and authentic, but they don't talk about the fact that there's an appropriate level of vulnerability and authenticity at work. And I've heard too many people say, my middle manager offloads on me, or my middle manager or my leader tells me too much I don't know about their marriage. I kind of have a basic, I would use the word formula, but it's far too developed for what I'm going to say, where I say, you share to the point that is helpful. So if I'm trying to be vulnerable, I say to you, I know this is stressful, I feel it too, and we need to move forward with it. We share to the point that helps other people to move forward. That's not the same as using our team as our counselor or a place to vent about the other senior leaders. It's about your vulnerability should help your team move forward and support them. There's also a piece about approachability. It's important for leaders to be able to be approached because if you're not, they're going somewhere else with that information and you're down important data. And so the approachability isn't about you being likable. It's actually just about you listening. And instead of responding, if you don't know what to say, you say, let me get back to you on that one. So the approachability is simply receiving what people give you and then go and think and panic and do whatever you have to do privately. But
Yeah.
the approachability is you listen. It's not that you pretend if you're not a very compassionate person, and some people aren't, you don't have to pretend or fawn, but you do need to just listen. In terms of authenticity, and I have a real issue with this at the moment because everyone's saying you should be authentic at work. But when they say that, they're not talking about, like, nobody says, I want the homophobic, racist person to be authentic at work, but that's their authenticity. So,
Mm,
what do we really mean? We want people to be somewhat kind of congruent with who they are at work, but we need people to be able to be themselves to the point that it's helpful at work. So,
mm,
your homophobic, racist colleagues have a right to work too, unfortunately. Thankfully, they don't have a right to discriminate, but they do have a right to be in the workplace. And I say unfortunately because it might not be nice for you or me to deal with, right? But they have a right to believe that, but we still have to work with them in some way. And they don't have a right to be discriminatory at work. Thankfully, in Ireland, we have legislation. It could be better, but we have legislation.
mm,
But what we need to do with authenticity is what's the amount of authenticity that's needed that is appropriate and will help the other person? So, appropriate being what will help us in the relationship, given the context, given the reality, and then also what's appropriate. Do you need to know that I had a fight with my partner this morning?
mm,
No, but you might need to know I'm having a stressful morning. So authenticity in the workplace has to be appropriate. Otherwise, it becomes kind of leaking or it becomes misusing the workplace to express our full selves. And we should have friends and colleagues and, partners and, different groups that we do that. Whereas when I come to work, I don't wear my fluffy pajamas that I wear at home with my niece and nephew when we're having a sleepover. So authenticity has an appropriateness. And I just think we need to focus on what's appropriate for helping people understand us and the situation so that we can move forward. If we get distracted and we misuse it, people actually will trust us less. And
mm,
if we inappropriately become vulnerable, and what I mean by that is if I'm now leaning on my colleague as a therapist instead of going to therapy, we will undermine ourselves. So vulnerability should help people understand us appropriately for the setting that we're in.
yeah, very good. So, what transformations have you witnessed in leadership or organizations that kind of stand out as powerful examples of your work, and working with different organizations over the years?
Yeah, I suppose I'm always a bit astounded by the impact that some of the work I do can have because a lot of the work I do is just facilitation. And what I mean by that is it's just helping people think things through with different points of view, challenging some concepts. But the number one unintended positive consequence. And I said this last week at a training and they were laughing because I was trying to get them to guess from doing any kind of development work that I've worked with. And we record results up to 6 months after I work with somebody or groups is positive personal relationships.
Mm.
So the majority of leadership work is about relating more effectively. And it's about creating relationships that get work done. And thankfully, when you do that, you also, and this is like reports I've got from people over years, my wife, my partner, my kids, my siblings, my parents, like these are the kind of comments I hear, have said I'm more approachable, I'm more understanding, I've been more honest with them than they found I have before. They said I'm less closed off. So one of the kind of interesting things is that to get good at leadership, you have to be good at some strategy and policy and systems, but you've also to be really good relationally. And a lot of us don't learn relational work in school, even in college. And so putting some time aside to do that not just helps effectiveness at work, it does genuinely help personally. So that's one of the things I really love because for me, I think about people holistically. Even when I'm helping them be effective as leaders, I'm thinking about how this is honest about who they are rather than pretending to be something they're not. I think about not giving them a cookie cutter design of a good leader, but helping them form what a good leader is in their mind. And the other things that kind of happen, I'll say personal and then I'll do systemic, but is a sense of empowerment. People, when they, when we've done interventions, whether individual or in group, often say, I'm more sure of myself. I understand myself better, so I'm more sure. And like, you could spend your whole life trying to be more sure. That's deeply powerful stuff, on a personal level. And then the other thing people say is, I can think about it better. So that's the other thing. There's a lot of critical thinking in the work that I do, where it's not about right and wrong. It's about what's effective, what's needed, what's the consequences I'm willing to deal with. Because a lot of people like to pretend there's just a right and a wrong. Most of the time, there's two less than perfect questions or options, and we have to make a call on them. So personally, they're the things that I think go beyond the workplace that I do. In workplaces, there's one example where, unions were involved. There was a big risk of newspaper, like a really big, situation could have come out of it. And when I went in, um, and I do this frequently, so there's lots of organizations. So if anyone's listening that I've worked with, don't just assume it's your organization, because unfortunately, we all kind of see ourselves. But basically, I went in to facilitate a process to solve a problem. And by the time we got to the end of it, people understood that the problem wasn't what they thought it was in the beginning. And all of the hassle, all of the newspapers, all of the leaks, all of the kind of union noise didn't need to happen because actually they understood the real issue at hand by working through it in a facilitated way. And one of the things I think we miss a lot in workplaces, we get to zero-sum games and conflict, whether it's interdepartmental or leader on leader or decisions that are being made. We assume that you win or you lose. There's a zero-sum game here. Someone's going to be disappointed. But a lot of the time, we just haven't really worked through the situation fully or understood each other. And so what I often find is not only do organizations, when I work with them, come out with better results, usually more critical thinkers because so they make better decisions, generally speaking. They can think things through. They can also prevent problems in the future because they're not just getting the short-term wins, they see the knock-on effect. But they also often mature the people they're working with. So whether it's a senior leadership team or I'm working with managers, their understanding of situations mature and they become less reactive in day-to-day challenges. So we've had all sorts of outcomes from, measuring a number of interventions that happen in workplaces that wouldn't have before I worked with them, happier employees, more strategic thinking leadership teams. But ultimately, I think it's a more mature workforce, whether it's that I'm working with the managers or the leaders, and that trickles out, um, as well as the original issue that they hire me for, right? So they hire for an original issue, but then there's these positive additional outcomes that, for me, are deeply, deeply valuable. But the original problem is the thing they pay me to solve with them.
Yeah. And it is amazing when you're talking about that, and working with leaders in conflict and, the yes or no or the right or wrong. It is amazing that they say, I felt so sure or more sure of myself and how it impacted my personal and professional life. So really, when you look at it, is there a big difference or, the impact? Does it differ between coaching and consulting for you when you're working with leaders?
So when I'm working with leaders in a coaching capacity, um, my job in that setting is using a coaching approach where they are the expert of their experience. And my job is to ask questions, challenge some thinking, point to different points of view. But they are individually co-constructing their idea of what a good leader is or isn't. And they are most definitely the expert. I might have expertise that I offer because it would just be silly not to say, oh, I don't think that's legally compliant, or have you thought of this? Because I've seen it in another company. But ultimately, our focus is on them as a leader being more strategic and effective relationally, and having a greater impact. But they are the expert of the industry, the work that they're doing, the way they're going to move forward, and the content that we discuss. When I'm consulting, while I might use coaching approaches in some of the work, I'm bringing usually some form of expertise into the conversation, whether it's through seeing other organizations do it, whether it's through, something to do with my research, whether it's to do with models that work more effectively than others. But my focus in those moments is more strongly towards they're saying we have this problem, we want your insight. So I'm sharing insight, but I do use a coaching approach in that. So I still ask questions. I'm still curious about if they think it will work, but they are paying me for more direct insight, and usually at an organizational level. In the leadership coaching, while people kind of want me to fix it, because that's quite normal, in coaching, whether it's the individual or the team, I might have some insights, but my main focus is developing their capacity to solve their own problem. In the consultancy, it's often to give them something that they won't be able to get on their own, and then to help them build their own capacity to do it without me. So it's just a slightly different focus.
Mm.
And usually the consultancy is used at the point where people have thought they're going in the right direction and are getting lots of unintended negative consequences. Usually then they say, why is that happening? And that might be where I use a model or a method or the research to help explain it, and we might redirect it. But it's insight orientated expertise. And I hate the word expertise, but it's more leaning on that. But I think what's different in my consultancy to traditional consultants is my model is still that they help themselves, because I have a small firm. I don't have time to be working with everyone forever, right? Whereas the bigger firms, that's their job. They want to bill hours. Well, I actually just want to help organizations to get the information they need and then run with it themselves and have internal capacity. Simply because I have a smaller model. My idea, I don't want to build loads of things. I want to work with companies that I enjoy working with and have meaningful relationships. So there's a slightly different intention. So eventually, with anyone I consult with, the goal is that they will work with themselves. It's not that I keep billing them or keep giving them reasons to consult. Whereas the bigger firms, that's how they're so big, right? Is that they continue to offer you solutions for problems you have, and not necessarily helping you develop capacity.
I love that. So really, you're empowering
Mm,
the people that you work with to come find solutions for themselves. And that's a real development, isn't it? It's
mm,
like when we were talking before we pressed record, Sheila, we were talking about the podcast, and I said it's a learning experience because you're growing through that learning and finding ways, and through listening to other people and being inspired by other people and saying, oh, yeah, that could work really well. I'm going to try that. So, as you said, a lot of people want us to fix things constantly. They want a quick solution, an easy fix, and we're not truly learning about ourselves or how we can find that solution going forward. So I love that you have that approach. So how do you support clients then in aligning their performance and their well-being, like especially when it's like high pressure environments and they're saying, I don't have time for all of this,
mm.
I need the quick fix.
Yeah, so I suppose it depends who I'm dealing with, and why they're saying they don't have time. So there are times in everyone's career where the well-being will be put second for some reason. They're on a sprint, they're pushing for something. That's not necessarily the time I'm going to come in and say, focus on your well-being, because the truth is they won't, right? So
Yeah.
it's not even that I won't say it, they won't. So it's a waste of our exchange. But I think what we have to realize is that some people with some identities have been unconsciously socialized to do more of the invisible work and the glue work. And they're the people that we see burn out more, right? So the first thing that I do when someone is in that tension, if I know that their identity might be part of it or how they've been socialized, is I show them some of that systemic stuff. So instead of saying, no, sometimes people say, I'm so terrible, Sheila. I know I should make more time for my evening walk. I just don't have time. Instead of me going down, did you do the evening walk? Did you not do the evening walk? I might focus more on it's really interesting because I see this group statistically, and I'll have research to kind of back it up. will give up on their leisure time more than this group. What do you think of that? And they're like, really? Is that a thing? I'm like, that's a thing. So that we bring it back to the system part. So the person can realize that they are replicating something they've been taught to do rather than simply that they aren't good enough, which is sometimes what happens. And this is why some people identify as having imposter syndrome when they don't have imposter syndrome. They've just been socialized to take on more responsibility than others and never quite feel rested or good enough. Um, the other thing, besides looking at some of the system patterns, is I talk to the person about what they're truly trying to create. And I have a kind of a very basic model, which is we're either avoiding something or moving towards something.
Mm.
And if I notice that someone's avoiding something, that's what we work on. So instead of me working on the walk, we work on what are you avoiding by not going on the walk? We work on the avoidance. But equally, I focus on what are you trying to create? Like what is it you're aiming for? And and sometimes that their behavior doesn't align with what they want at all.
Mm.
And when we start to unpack that maybe deeper, maybe more unconscious stuff in a practical way now, they tend to understand that the way they're working and their well-being is out of balance for more than just them making decisions, which is often what people think I just need to do it differently. The other reason, like well-being and performance are not separate. If you speak to any professional athlete, you absolutely cannot perform at peak without rest.
Mm.
Before and after. And one of my issues in workplaces using a lot of performance psychology without understanding or integrating the rest part is that organizations are setting, and when I say organizations, it means leaders, managers, ourselves, we're doing it to ourselves, are setting expectations that are not humanistic, that they're not relevant to a human. If I was a robot, I'd still need a repair. But it's getting people to think about that piece that optimal performance is only sustainable if we also are being replenished appropriately. And I'm awful at this, right? Because I absolutely love my work. I tend to overwork. I've done much better in the last few years. A chronic illness has made it so that I don't have a choice in a way, which is a bit annoying, but also weirdly a gift because I had to face the imbalance. But for me, for some of us, we'll never get that balance right. We'll just have to struggle with it. For others, they'll get really good routines and they'll just hold them. Um, to me, as long as we know performance and well-being are side by, they're in a relationship, they're the eight, they're the infinity, they impact each other, then we can kind of tweak them as needed.
Mm.
And one doesn't happen without the other, but that doesn't mean that during the deadline I take a rest instead of do my job, right? But equally, if I'm at a deadline every day and I'm overworking every day, well, then I may be doing more than one person's job. And at that point, I may be exploiting myself. And people talk a lot about what the company's doing, and that's why I'm not talking about it. I would if I'm working with the company, but whenever I'm talking to someone, I talk about what they have control over, not what the other does, because the other I have no control over. But the person in front of me can make choices. And when I say to people, it sounds like you're exploiting yourself, that no, 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 the company's exploiting me. I'm like, the company maybe, but you are in agreement with it. Now, there are people who do not have the privilege of leaving companies, changing jobs, get
Mm.
paid too little, so they have to overwork. There's a lot of inequities and inequalities across the world and also across our economy and Europe and Ireland and the UK. So it's not always possible. But in that case, I talk to people about being strategic. So what do you want for yourself? Do you want
Mm.
to be struggling with this in 10 years? And if not, well, then we need to make a plan where well-being is part of something you've designed because it won't happen by accident. It's in nobody's interest, bar your own, for you to be well and your family. So no other structure is going to help you be well. Um, and and when I say that to people, they do get a bit surprised because there's so much money gone into wellness activities. But a lot of wellness activities in workplaces are like fun moments, unless they're giving you time off work or they're helping you recover or they're giving you supports, as in therapy, supervision, coaching, things like that. A lot of it, or resourcing you, you know, a lot of it doesn't result in wellness. They're just called well-being activities or they're talks to tell you how to be well. The only like it is absolutely your responsibility to take care of your well-being first and foremost, because it's the only thing that nobody else will take care of for you.
I love that, Sheila. And that's one of the things I often say to clients is when you are ready to take responsibility for yourself and for your life, that's the only time it is going to change. And it may not change immediately, but it will take little steps throughout, those changes through different choices you create in that day, in that week, and in that year that are going to eventually, down the road, you're going to see that change. But it's
Mhm.
not just as again, I come back to the quick fixes or you telling them what they should do. And I love the fact that you make them almost take ownership of it, that you are exploiting yourself, because it's easy to blame others, is blame our companies, blame everything else, society. We are responsible for ourselves, and it is really important to show up, as we are, but sometimes we need that support, don't we, from
Mm.
others to show us, or maybe stand outside and observe or witness ourselves as somebody else sees us. And I suppose you've got many a shock from people saying, am I exploiting myself? Am I really, Sheila? And it's a hard truth for people is to hear, and they stand and they look at themselves and go, I've done this for 25 years. And I've always blamed the different companies or the leaders I've worked with. And maybe I had a role to play in that as well. It's a hard one, isn't it?
Yeah, and just to be really clear, nobody really rewards you for boundaries or taking responsibility for yourself. And what I mean by this is I will be less liked when I say no, thank you, I don't want the work, or I'm sorry, that's underpaid, or, you know, nobody is going to be grateful to you that you have boundaries, bar possibly your loved ones, because they're probably paying the real price when you're overworked or not boundaried. And so one of the reasons we do it is we've learned to get on and stay safe by giving people what they want. But people and organizations don't know what's enough. Like they can't know what's too much for you because it would be different to me. And so sometimes there's this false idea that everyone around us should just know. And that's nobody's fault. But then also, it is difficult when you take responsibility and you say, actually, I'm doing this to myself. And there might also be really good reasons. You might have grown up having to do it. You might have to do it because you might be the only bread earner in the house, or you might have debts that are really difficult to manage. Like, there's very good reasons that we make these decisions. But if we want to optimally perform and also thrive, because they're not always together, we can perform and not thrive, and we want to live a sustainable work life, let's say, then we have to kind of say, what are we doing contributing to it? Because one of the things I found with some clients is they go from organization to organization. I meet them prior to retirement, let's say, I'm thinking of a few, and they'll say, I've just always overworked and I want to work in a workplace that doesn't overwork me. And I'll say, oh, the pattern is you, and yes, workplaces are going to squeeze. That's kind of how it works in capitalism. They have to get more from you than they pay you, but you still can have boundaries. And there is a balance because I hear about people talk about different generations and saying some generations won't give as much to the workplace as others. There's actually a balance. There is a line where it's too much, and there's also a line where it's too little. And I think our exchange with the workplace needs to be a bit more balanced and not hoping that they'll recognize us or eventually give us a rest or we'll stop asking for things. It doesn't stop. And so we've to find where we do have control over our lives and our work. And some of us have more and others have less for lots of circumstances. So it's not an equal issue in the first place either. But it is still, there's always something within our control.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. And it is the balance, and I know we're all trying to find this work-life balance and we're trying to look after our well-being a little bit more, but we still want to offer, better performances, whatever role it is in we life. But to me, it's always standing back, and know it may seem very simplified, but I would ask myself in times where I feel stressed or overwhelmed by the amount of work or clients or whatever it is, and I stand back for a moment and say, what is it you need right now,
Mm.
Sharon? What is it you need in this moment to help support you? And it's a very simple question, but
Mm.
it starts that conversation, Sheila, within yourself, doesn't it? To say, if you're not supporting yourself, you can't expect anybody else to support you.
Hmm. It's such a good question. And I use a similar question, you know, what do you need and what don't you need? Because sometimes I'm doing things I don't need. Um, but it's a really important point. Unfortunately, in workplaces, we get into some weird kind of dynamic where where there's this idea that the workplace should give us everything we need, um, including the support at work. And that's not always the case because for some people, doing their job is easier than for others doing the exact same job. It's a lot more complex or nuanced.
Mm.
But I think our needs are probably the central piece. And what I find is a lot of people are uncomfortable with their needs.
Mm.
When I say, "Oh, do you need a break?" They'll say, "No, no, 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 but we'll stop for a few minutes," right? There's all this kind of interesting avoidance of needs, but needs are the most humanistic thing we have. It's
Mm.
nobody doesn't have needs, and if they're
Mm.
denying needs, they're probably just going around kind of carrying a lot of weight, really, because we have a lot of needs as people.
Mm.
And I think there's this lovely quote. I don't know. I know it from social work. I don't know if you've heard this one, but I really like it. And it says, the people that it's for like social workers working with young people with very, very difficult behavior. Um, the people who need the most love behave in the least loving ways.
Mm.
And when I worked with social workers who are working with young people, who were in awful situations with awful trauma in their experience, who did behave in very unloving ways, that used to be the quote we used to remind ourselves, and we used to talk about when we were, the worse the behavior, the bigger the need. And I think sometimes we forget that for ourselves. So the snappier I am, the more critical I am, the more judgmental I am, usually is a sign of the bigger the need I have that I'm not in relationship with. And so I kind of use that need when I love it. It's a main one that I use moving through my life, which is what do I need and what don't I need? Because sometimes I'm doing things I don't need. Like I don't need the pressure of producing a perfect X. I don't need to do the 10 things I have in my diary, and it just makes such a difference. To that sense of kind of being capable of the day ahead, being capable of the challenges, because we will constantly have challenges outside our control. Um, but what is in our control is how we respond to them. But if we're already at zero, the responses aren't going to be great. Like we're going to really struggle. So I love that. And I think everything to do with who we are as people is our needs. Now, we can't always get our needs met where we want them to be met. That's another thing. It's not, I might want my wife to be lovely and sweet, and she might be really stressed. So today is not the day for her to be lovely and sweet to me,
Mm.
you know. But my needs might be able to be met by me calling a friend and saying, "Oh, can you be lovely and sweet to me?" So it's not, while all needs are valid, not all needs can be met where we want them to be. And I think that maybe that's another thing that can get a bit confusing when we talk about needs in workplaces as well.
Yeah. And again, I think what you said there is the boundaries as well, where you are in work and life and what's the expectation, of work for you. And it kind of comes back to something as well when anybody goes for a job or a position, depending on what it is and where it is in the company, it's again what they're looking for and how you're going to add value and your purpose for moving into that role, not to forget that. I know a lot of people want to do it for a salary and position and growing their career, but at the underneath it all, what is that purpose and passion that has drawn you towards this career? And to remember that even on the days when it is stressful and everything, and come back again to it going, do you remember why you came to work for this company? Do you remember the enthusiasm and the positive, passion that you were coming in with? And of course, things get in the way and it doesn't always work to plan, but we lose that along the way. I've seen it, even with
Mm,
my own clients, Sheila, and even with doctors and nurses and their passion when they went into care for others, and it gets lost in policy and admin and resources and everything. And sometimes they just want to say, I just want to go and look after my patient.
mm,
And it is disheartening. But if we come back and remember, if I can follow that purpose and passion, within myself and hold that in this company, and maybe this isn't the right company, maybe there's another
mm.
company. I think to remember that within ourselves, that we don't get lost either. And that is as well as coming back to what do I need for myself, but what do I
Yeah.
need from that place I work in as well or work with?
Yeah, I really love that because there's a couple of things about that I think are important. One is that a lot of people like the notion of something, but haven't worked out what they like doing all day. All
Mm.
right. So I say to people, what do you actually like doing? Like in terms of the task, do you like talking to people? Do you like being alone? Do you like solving problems? Do you like reading long documents? And when I get people to think about the actual activities instead of the job, it starts to help them realize they might have had an idea of a job without understanding the daily reality. And that can help people kind of think about the decisions that they're making. The
Mm,
other one is that sometimes we have Melanie Klein does this work called fantasy work, and it's about how children, and it's with a PH, not F, children have fantasies of their parents being perfect, right? Because otherwise they'd be terrified. Imagine knowing your parent is deeply flawed, doesn't know what they're doing, it's their first time too, they're winging it, right? You'd be terrified if you were 6 months and realized your parent is Googling how to keep you alive, right? You'd be terrified. But that's the reality, right? So what happens is we as adults do that in workplaces a little bit too. We have fantasies that the leaders are like either good or bad. They're one or the other. They're either everything right or everything wrong. The workplace is either perfect or bad. And the reality is that every workplace is going to be flawed. Every job has things you won't love. And there might be days you love it more than other days. And what we've to decide is whether how we're interacting with it is having an impact on us, or if
mm,
it's just the environment. So for instance, I wouldn't love to be working in a commercial kitchen anymore because I find it deeply stressful and I'm anxious 24/7. I loved it at the time when I was younger. I don't love it now. Um, can I cook? Yes. Could I be paid to do it? I don't know if anyone would pay me anymore to do it, but there's a potential job there. But the reality is I don't actually like the practical reality of that any longer. And so being there, even if I have a positive attitude, unless it's for a one-off day, isn't going to be something I enjoy because the day-to-day experience isn't positive. Whereas there's other things like when I started this business, someone said to me, "Oh, you're living the dream." And I'm like, whose dream and what dream? Because I work with clients, I have to do way more research, training, and development for myself than I've ever had to do. Especially in the beginning, I do a lot more learning and activities, loads of admin. You run a business, you have to understand law, to understand all sorts of things I didn't even know
mm,
were part of anything. I only knew that people knew about them individually, an accountant, a lawyer, and I suddenly have to know a bit of everything. And
mm,
I remember this person went on to run their own practice. And I said, once it becomes your normal job, you have to find the joy in it again because you're not going to get the same buzz as you did in year 1 or 2 when you work with people. Now, actually, it's your job. It's what you do. And you can love it, but it's not going to be the same as when you were in year 1 or 2 as when you're in year 14 or 15.
mm,
And at the time they're like, oh no, I'll never. And then after a while they said, oh my God. Yeah. And I'm like, because every job eventually has some repetitive piece, even if there's parts of you that love what you're doing.
mm,
And it's our job to figure out what the balance is that helps us kind of perform and thrive, and maybe have minimal stuff we hate. I hate doing the books. I hate reading all my emails sometimes, but that's a big part of the job. I hate writing proposals. Um, all of these things I dislike. Now, thankfully, I'm able to have someone on board who does those things for me now. But for a long time, I didn't. It had to be me. So there's a piece about understanding that in every great outcome, there will still be less than perfect realities. It's a
mm.
bit like in your beautiful new home that you've bought. You're still going to have to clean it.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely. So, what keeps you grounded and inspired in your work, Sheila, every day, especially on those tough days with the hundreds of emails and proposals?
yeah. Well, I suppose I originally started working for myself and doing this work because I wanted to continue learning. And when I sit with people, there's no more learning than sitting with people. Even when I'm supporting them
Mm,
or consulting, that ability to be curious and paid to be curious and to help people figure things out is really, really motivating part of my day. Now, when I'm burnt out, fatigued, and I took on too much work, I feel not quite like that, right? So my job is to stay well enough so that's a good thing. The other thing is that I think it matters. A lot of people doing a lot of really meaningful work don't have a fundamental understanding of how different people are and don't realize that the way they set people up can be the difference between whether they perform or not. And I suppose from my background and the work that I do now, I just think it's really important that we create workplaces where people can do really good work and feel proud of themselves, can personally thrive. And ultimately, the reason being, if I go back to like, when they ask Miss World, what do you want for the world? And she says peace. I say a world where people are well. And we spend more time at work than mostly anywhere
mm,
else. We usually spend more time in our workplace than with our partners and our kids. And so, to me, if we can support people in workplaces figuring out better ways forward, they become better citizens. We make better decisions, like nationally. We have
mm,
better public conversations. We create better, um, better environments for people to live. We intervene where there's inappropriate, inhumane things happening. And so for me, I just remember that first of all, I'm part of a really big picture. There's hundreds of people doing their version of this in different ways, like trying to have these impacts. But then I also remember we're on the shoulders of giants. You
Mm,
know, people fought for the right for you and me to vote, and people fought for the right of you and me to wear pants. People fought for the right of us to go to work. People fought for the right of us to have mental health facilities that had protocols. They couldn't just put us in because we didn't do what we were told.
mm,
People fought for all sorts of rights. And I just think about the fact that this is kind of a little bit of our obligation when we come next to try and leave things better than we found them. And I don't say that in a up in the airway. I mean, every day I ask myself that question.
mm,
And when I've been a real horrible person to someone, or I've been snappy, or, because I'm just a human, or I've given out to someone, or I just think, okay, that wasn't a great job there, Sheila. We won't do it again. We might need to go back and say, oh my God, I showed myself up there. That was bad form. I was in a bad space. But I do think about the fact that people go home and go to bed and we know nothing about what's really going on in their
mm,
minds or their world. And we could just do better, all of us to each other. And then that could create a stronger outcome. So for me, it's much bigger than me. Shoulders of giants. There's people who came before me, and it would just be a bit selfish to just gain the benefits without thinking about the space and the world I'm creating with others. And then also, I think that we can have better qualities of lives, better relationships, and why wouldn't we do that? And because I'm allowed to be curious in my job, I never know enough. So I do another course, and people are like, how does that connect to that? And I'm like, I did a designer course during COVID where I learned about like fashion, and people were like, how does that connect to anything? I was like, well, actually, I realized that women are judged more on how they look. And then I went and did research into the power of clothes and
mm,
the judgments that people have on women. And suddenly it made total sense why I was doing this course that looked really different to what I do, because I was understanding how power and rules on women interact in the workplace. So for me, it's just about being curious. That's my personal gain. And then I think collectively, I think it's about trying to do something a bit better in the world.
You are a pleasure to have on the podcast, Sheila Walsh. I love it. You're a mine of information, but also inspiring because, again, you're making a difference. And that's all each one of us hope to do in the world. And that might be a silent difference in one person's life, or it might be a big difference in an organization or company's business. But I think when we have that curiosity going out there, and what else can I do? How else can I help? And remembering again why we started to do what we wanted to do and find a balance within ourselves and being real with ourselves, isn't it also? And saying none of us are perfect and we can judge others, whether that be in your workplace or in your community. But behind every judgment, there is a person that could be struggling with something else that you'll never know anything about. Sheila, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Sharon. I really appreciate it.
It was lovely. I really enjoyed the conversation. So your book, they can find it through buythebook.ie. It was also an Amazon and Irish Times bestseller. Congratulations,
Thank
Sheila.
you.
That's amazing. And you also www.sheilawalsh.com to check out all information, how you can contact Sheila, how she can help you or your organization. And you also have the Ellis Book Club, a monthly leadership book recommendation and professional development resources, which is brilliant as well. You offer so much, Sheila. And I love that 11-year-old that was curious about working in a kitchen is still curious about working in the world and what you can learn next. So well done to you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. I appreciate it.
So thank you to everybody for listening. I will put all of the details about Sheila in the show notes. And again, check out her on sheilawalsh.com, buythebook.ie, and you can find her on LinkedIn and on Instagram. Until next time, take care of you.